It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our moderator. I was going to say, and I will say Professor Sarah Bloom Raskin, but I could also say Governor Sarah Bloom Raskin or Secretary Sarah Bloom Raskin. The point is that while Sarah is teaching now, she's had a series of illustrative posts, more titles than any of us will ever have. She was the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, 2014 to 2017, a member of the Board of Governors, the Fed's Board of Governors, 210 to 214, Counsel for the Senate Banking Committee, Chief Regulator for the State of Maryland, and now Moderator for the Plenary on Climate Alignment for Financial Institutions. One of her former mentors, we do have sources here, but we went all the way to Texas to get this, identified her record simply as stellar, noting that it came from combining a deep legal mind, a grip on the economics, and an instinct for politics. He also noted her exceptional expertise, her independence, her integrity, and her devotion to the public interest. We will add her bravery. So Sarah is very brave. She recognized long ago that the economy is an environmental issue and that environmental issues are economic. She put it much better. She said, if we ignore climate change, we in essence destroy the economy. The conclusion follows: financial regulators should understand climate change as risk, the most penetrating kind of risk. Again, she put it better. She has written, financial regulators must reimagine their own role so that they can play their part in the broader reimagining of the economy. We're incredibly lucky to have her on this plenary, and I will turn it over, Sarah, to you and to the members of the plenary.
Morning in progress.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for that lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Of all of those titles, I think the one that pleases me the most at the moment is getting to moderate this panel, the Money as a Democratic Medium 2.0. So we are really in store today for this session, a really extraordinary set of discussions with an extraordinary panel. I should say that the MDM 2.0 is really quickly gaining a reputation as a collection of cutting-edge thinkers and researchers across relevant disciplines, really connecting insights relevant to money, to justice, to finance, to the economy, both the macroeconomy and the microeconomy, to financial regulation, and of course to the institutions that are accountable in a democratic society for delivering. So really, given this set of topics, it was, not a surprise to me, actually, when Christine called to ask whether climate really could be part of 2.0. And I said, absolutely, absolutely, on the condition, of course, that we bring together really some of the sharpest minds in this space from disparate fields. And alas, that is what we get this afternoon. We get three really esteemed thinkers in this space, named Aden, Fligstein, and Nadav Orian. The three N's, we will call them the three N's. Okay, but they will be really engaging with us today on this topic, and I will introduce them with more specificity momentarily. But first, let me provide really some context for today's discussion. And of course, as it pertains to the effects of climate change on the financial sector, we think about the effects of climate change on the financial sector and the effects of the financial sector on climate change. Okay, so we are going to be looking essentially at sort of two causations, okay? What the effects of climate change might be on the financial sector and what the financial sector is doing in turn to the climate and to the economy, okay? And this, by the way, has a term associated with it, often called double materiality, right? Another way to look at double materiality is this idea of a two-winged plane, okay? So another frame for the discussion really is one having to do with risk management on the one hand, alignment on the other. And what do we mean with these phrases? Risk management is the notion of looking at the effects of climate change on the financial sector. That is a pursuit primarily of risk management. How does the financial sector manage various risks associated with climate? Risks to their portfolios, risks to their operations, risk to the ability of their borrowers to repay loans. So it is primarily a risk management kind of focus, okay? But the second wing is the wing of alignment. Alignment is another way of looking at the question of how the financial sector is going to affect and is affecting climate, is affecting through its activities, through its lending, its guarantees, its financing of particular operations. How is it in turn affecting the course of what we call really the decarbonization transition? Okay, so the two wings of the plane, so to speak, are the risk management wing, which again is how climate change affects the financial sector, and then the alignment wing, which is how the financial sector affects climate change. Okay, now the alignment piece is an approach that is quite out there from the perspective of policy. It is one that has not been attempted in any serious way in the US. And we'll talk about kind of why, what those challenges are, and whether those challenges are worth, pragmatically speaking, trying to be overcome. But in the US, policy is absent on both fronts, okay? It's absent on the risk management front, and it's absent on the alignment front. The risk management side, you might say, how do I know? What's the evidence that it's not happening here in the US? Well, first of all, what we would expect to see, if it were happening, would be some evidence of a supervisory imperative. In other words, you would expect to see, if there were real risk management going on, some kind of directive coming from financial regulators, meaning bank examiners and insurance examiners, and essentially some kind of government actor guiding the financial sector into considerations of various climate-related financial risks. In the US, we don't see that. We don't see that. We also don't see in the US economic modeling that takes into account a climate-altered set of market interactions. So if you probe the modeling that is done, used essentially to make predictions, predictions on the inflation rate or the unemployment rate or any kind of macro or micro variables, you will have a hard time finding in those models any assumptions that match reality, that essentially fold in a climate-altered set of market behaviors. So that's kind of my second piece of evidence that we don't have risk management, a risk management perspective or set of policies, coming out of the US. In terms of financial regulation, if you think about the traditional tool sets that financial regulators use, they use, for example, stress testing, capital rules. These kind of standard risk management tools have not been tweaked from a climate perspective. So you don't see, for example, what you see, that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is doing, or the Bank of England is doing, which is this notion of a climate-related stress test. That we don't see in the US, okay? We don't have in the US specialized rules on capital and how that capital, the risk weights associated with that capital might be altered given a certain loans which may have different climate characteristics, okay? So now it is true, we might have disclosure in the US, and that of course is a risk management tool for some. I would hardly call that the full toolbox of what can be done from a risk management perspective. And we also know that disclosure currently is not, it has not become a finalized rule by the SEC. So it's not yet there. It doesn't seem to be completely ready for prime time. So this is a bit really of the evidence that I have gathered that indicates that we have absent policy from the risk management side. Outside the US, we have similar evidence, and we're going to probe some of that also today, having to do with the so-called GFANs, right? The GFANs being one of the alliances, kind of the umbrella alliance that brings together different sectors in the financial world to look at coming together to create voluntary standards, right? So you've got a group of insurers, right, who came together voluntarily to set, but to look at different approaches towards climate. We've seen it in the asset manager side. Asset managers have their own voluntary alliance. Commercial banks have a voluntary alliance. So they're voluntary, you don't need to be part of them, and sure enough, they are crumbling, okay? They are falling apart, and it really was just in the last 2 weeks you saw both the disintegration of the net zero alliance for insurance companies, by the way, combined with insurance companies in California being joined by other insurance companies to back away from insuring home buying in California and in other states where there are severe weather events. So in the insurance space, at least, you have a stepping away of kind of voluntary alliances coming together that were meant to have as their purpose the idea of bringing together an understanding, a deeper understanding of what risk management standards the industry itself would agree to come together and manage their risk from climate. And we're not going to be likely not seeing much coming out of those alliances at this point. I should also say that in the US, we have evolved into what I call a threat agnostic approach, okay, to risk management. It used to be understood that in order to really manage risk well, if you're a financial firm, you kind of need to understand what the risk is. Is it a risk coming from crypto? Is it a risk coming from cybersecurity? Is it a risk coming from subprime mortgages? You needed a sense of where the risk was coming from. Climate, as we know, has become a don't get near this topic kind of risk. You cannot talk about climate without being deemed to be woke, without being deemed to be inappropriately political. So it's very challenging to think about risk management when you can't really name the risk. But that is the scenario that we're dealing with in the US, where there is, by policymakers, a reluctance to actually even say climate-related financial risk. And when you do say it, there are consequences. So climate-related financial risk is a statement, is a phrase that you will not hear uttered too much, which isn't to say that the financial regulators are not thinking about risk. They're just not going to mention it as a climate-related one. And we can talk about what the pros and cons are of that approach. Can you do risk management without naming the risk? Can you do it in a threat agnostic way? And that is that's the sphere though that we are working in the US, where it is threat agnostic, not threat specific. As you can imagine, I would argue that you lose quite a bit when you don't understand the actual transmission and contours of climate as a financial risk. Hence, we come to the notion of maybe it's time to move away from this notion of climate-related financial risk. I mean, after all, nobody is saying it. We have become kind of threat agnostic, and there's urgency. There is a real urgency here. And while it might have been completely appropriate to talk about climate-related financial risk at one time, we know that from a climate change perspective, we are moving into a much more dramatic set of events, losses, hurricanes, floods, smoke. We are, in essence, in a state of urgency that maybe creates an imperative to pause and say, a financial regulation approach and a risk management approach may not be sufficient. After all, financial risk management was done in an area, it's meant to be proactive. It's meant to actually be something you do ahead of time. And here we are in the midst of a set of emergencies, and it could actually be for naught to have an approach that is climate, that is a risk management approach. Okay. Well, that brings us to this next approach, this idea of an alignment approach. And we're going to probe today the contours of what an alignment approach entails. Let me say a little bit about the roadmap for our discussion today. So we are going to have each of our distinguished panelists speak for 10 minutes. I'm gonna try to throw some questions at them when they're done in light of the frame I just put out for us. And then we'll open it to you all and get more questions and get even more of a dialogue going here. So let me say, actually, before I do the introduction, I do want to say, just again, let me just say a little bit more about this alignment approach, because I don't want to give it short shrift. Again, think about it as meaning how the financial sector's activities affect climate change, okay? And I said earlier that it's not at all being built out here in the US. My evidence for that is we don't integrate science-based targets, right, into any notion of what bank lending should look like. So that isn't done. You would need to do that if you're doing an alignment approach. We don't do that here. There was an opportunity for the FSOC, the so-called Financial Stability Oversight Council, which many of you might know is a gathering. It's a group that was put together in the Dodd-Frank Act in the aftermath of the financial crisis. The leaders of all the financial regulatory agencies in the US, they come together, and what they're supposed to do is look at kind of systemic risk and where risks might be falling outside their jurisdictions, put on the hat of a collective systemic jurisdiction, and think about, is there risk accumulating in the seams here? The president had put out an executive order for the FSOC to actually look at this issue. They came out with a report. The report did not look at all at any alignment kind of strategy. It did not think about this notion of paring down the kind of lending and financial set of activities connected to a science-based set of targets. So that's another kind of piece of evidence. And a third piece of evidence for people who are really thinking about alignment as a strategy. If you want to think of an analogy, you think of the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act. That is some people could call that an alignment kind of strategy. It is a statute required by law. It's anti-redlining. It requires banks to actually make loans into low and moderate income and disadvantaged areas. It's an alignment kind of approach. CRA, for many of you who don't follow it, is not a particularly robust, it's a pretty robust statute, but it's not a particularly, doesn't have much robust enforcement. So we have to think, when we think about alignment, you might want to think about CRA as an example, and then we have to ask ourselves, how effective could this be? Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today are really what should be the relative weights of these two different approaches, a risk management approach and an alignment approach. Think about whether they're time dependent, whether your answer as to whether we should weigh one approach rather than another depends on where we are from a climate perspective. This is that sense of urgency question. Does the choice of policy or approach, is it dependent on time? Science. Is science ready? Is it ready to be integrated into a set of alignment postures? We need to ask that question. And finally, think about which approach might produce a less challenging set of hurdles from a political perspective, because of course we would like to be effective here. We would like things to work. So now, without further ado, I will introduce our distinguished panelists. The first to speak to us will be you, Nate Aden. So Nate, for many of you who don't know him, he is a leader, really, of the Science-Based Targets Initiative work. And he focuses that work on financial institutions, okay? So he is the guy, like he is the one that we need to talk to and learn from in order to understand the potential, really, of science-based targets and their ability to get integrated into an alignment kind of approach, okay? Since 2015, Nate has been hard at work contributing really to the technical foundation of this path-breaking work. He's also a senior fellow at the World Resource Institute's climate program. He holds a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you, Nate. You will be first. After Nate, we will hear from Neil Fligstein. Neil is the class of 1939 Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at Berkeley, and he's a director of the Center for Culture, Organization, and Politics. He also co-chairs the Network for a New Political Economy. For people who missed his last and most recent book, it's called The Banks Did It, An Anatomy of the Financial Crisis, which charts the history of the rise and fall of the mortgage securitization industry. Currently, Neil focuses on climate action in the corporate sector. So we are going to be turning to Neil for this idea of these voluntary alliances, their potential, what role they could possibly play. Okay. And then finally, Nadav Orian Peer, associate professor at the University of Colorado Law School, previously worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago in the Financial Markets Group. Nadav's current research focuses on alignment approaches to climate action. So Nadav will pull together some of the things I've just vaguely introduced in terms of alignment and what an alignment strategy might look like. And Nadav also is the co-editor of justmoney.org. So these are our three, and they're not just three ends. It's when you think about it, we have a scientist, we have a sociologist, and we have a law professor. Like a scientist, a sociologist, and a law professor walk into a bar, okay? And this is what we get. So I'm really pleased to be able to listen to each of you as you explain your work and obviously contribute to this discussion. So I will say we will attempt 10 minutes or so each Okay, and then we will, I'm going to be taking notes with some probing questions that we will launch into a discussion, and then, of course, turn to the audience. So with that, Nate.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, and greetings from Stockholm, where the sun is still up, and happy to be able to join this. Thank you to Nadav for inviting me, and for everyone for having me. So I will be giving an introduction and overview of the Science-Based Targets Initiative work with financial institutions. As Sarah mentioned, I've been with SBTI since we launched in 2015, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a collaboration between the World Resources Institute, where I work, and CDP, WWF, and the UN Global Compact. So in terms of the first question of what is a science-based target, it is a target that breaks down the global climate stabilization pathways to a target setting entity level. And in our case, we focus on the private sector. And so we focus on companies and financial institutions. And the idea is that these targets are a way to structure climate ambition in a way that's quantitative and consistent. And so one of the services that the SBT initiative offers is that we develop these criteria for assessing the targets, and then we do this independent third-party assessment of the entity's targets. So we're the only initiative globally that does this kind of quantitative assessment. In terms of the components of a science-based target, one way to simplify it is that there are 5. So the first is that it covers all greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon or methane. The second is that it's 5 to 10 years into the future from the target setting date. And so when we began this initiative, it was during the Paris Agreement, 2015. There were a lot of private sector entities that were very curious to align with 2050 scenarios, but there wasn't really much near-term understanding of what that meant. And so that's the 5 to 10 year portion. The third is that the ambition of the reductions are at least commensurate with a well below 2 degree pathway. Now we've increased that minimum ambition to 1.5 degree aligned. The fourth criteria is that they cover all of their emissions in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3. So the contribution that the World Resources Institute brings to this is that about 20 years ago, we developed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is something that we developed with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, that is a way for measuring a company or financial institution's greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. And so scope 1 emissions are from combustion of fossil fuels or from process emissions, if you're making cement, for example. Scope 2 emissions are from purchased electricity, heat, and steam, or cooling. And scope 3 emissions are the upstream and downstream value chain emissions associated with a particular company or activity. So for example, for this conference, there would be emissions that Christine was mentioning related to travel. That's one of the 15 categories of scope 3 emissions for a company. For many of the companies that come to us, the scope 3 is their largest source of emissions, whether it's category 1, purchased goods and services, use of sold product, for example, for auto manufacturers, for internal combustion engine vehicles, to financed emissions, which is the 15th category of scope 3 emissions. So what we require is that all of the target setting entities quantify their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And if scope 3 is greater than 40% aggregate scope 1, 2, and 3, they have to have a separate ambitious and measurable scope 3 target, which is something that was not a thing before SBTI. This is our signal achievement, is getting entities to quantify and address their scope 3 emissions. And I'll get to the rationale in the next slide. But then the fifth sort of high-level criteria is that they publish their emissions inventory annually so they can be tracked against this new public target that they have. Those are 5 very high-level targets. We have more than 20 specific criteria that the entities have to go through, but that's a summary for all of you in this short version. The next slide here just steps back a little bit for our theory of change. So as I said, we're a voluntary initiative. And really the service that we offer, in addition to developing these methods and criteria, is showcasing climate ambition within the private sector. And so the way that we work is to have this independent quantitative assessment and then elevate these target setting entities that have met our criteria. And what happens is that there's a competitive peer learning and peer one-upmanship component to this, so that once we have a few targeted, approved, published SBTs per sector and geography, then many of their peers and competitors want to jump in order to be credible. And so this is how we work. And this gets back to that scope 3 requirement that I mentioned, because as a voluntary initiative, generally in the beginning, it's often brands, consumer-facing retailers, for example, that come to us because they have their own business case for doing this. And for them, often they don't actually make anything. Their scope 1 emissions are de minimis. Really what they're doing is buying stuff from companies, rebranding it and selling it to people. And that's really, the big hook here, because people who buy these things, they have no idea who the large scope 1 emitters are in their lives. But if you get to the endpoint and then you work through the scope 3 to say, okay, X retailer, you now have to have a supplier engagement target to reduce those scope 1 emissions, which are the largest emissions in this particular target setting entity's inventory. Then they engage with their suppliers, and then their suppliers engage with their suppliers. So we've seen waves in SBTI. For example, Coca-Cola sets a target. Coca-Cola Bottling Company comes in a couple years later and says, oh, we've been engaged by our companies to set a target. They set a target. Then the glass companies come to us and set a target. So that's how this works. Just another thing to note here with regard to this particular discussion and some of the earlier speakers, this is a voluntary program, obviously, and we recognize that there are many entities that will never set an SBT, and they need to be dealt with. That tail on the right-hand side here needs to be dealt with regulatory approaches. SBT is not going to solve the whole situation for everyone. The idea with SBT is that it develops this leadership platform that, among other things, provides proof of concept for policymakers and regulators to understand that not only does this not jeopardize their economic competitiveness, but it can actually be beneficial to set up regulatory institutions to help these leading companies in the economy to actually achieve their targets and move in this direction. So that's some of our theory of change. In terms of where we are, we've been around for 8 years now. We've been doubling every year for the past 4 years. And now we have more than 5,000 companies and financial institutions that have committed to setting science-based targets, of which more than half have gone through and met all of our criteria. To Sarah's point about the US versus the rest of the world, if you look at the US, presently we have 350 companies and financial institutions with SBTs. In the UK, we have 500, and in Japan, we have 500. So I think you all know the relative sizes of the countries and economies there, but they're well ahead of the US in terms of SBT adoption. Just the other thing to note here is, the financial institutions are a smaller piece of this, and that's what I'm going to shift to now. Is I'm going to talk about the financial institutions aspect of the SBTI. So when we launched the science-based targets back in 2015, it was, sort of jump off the cliff and build the parachute on the way down type of startup. Basically, at WRI, we were being engaged by these private sector entities that had worked with us to help develop the greenhouse gas protocol. And they said, hey, we're using the GHGP to do our annual emissions inventory. Can you give us some guidance on aligning with this cool new Paris Agreement? We want to make it legit and credible. So we started these conversations, and we found that our counterparts at the UN Global Compact, which is the part of the UN that deals with the private sector, WWF and CDP were having similar conversations. So we decided to all band together here and make this initiative. And so we put forward a call to action that year for companies and financial institutions to commit to setting science-based targets. And we were going to build the criteria and figure this out. And we had a dozen commitments that year, and 10 of them were from financial institutions. So the financial institutions were eager out of the gate to do this in 2015. But we held them in abeyance because at the time we were in the midst of a project where we published the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 Guidance 2011, and immediately there was a lot of appetite for more guidance on Category 15, which is financed emissions. It's the idea of quantifying the emissions associated with investment and lending activities. Much more abstract than all the other categories of emissions accounting. And so we started a project with a technical partner and with the UN to develop specified greenhouse gas protocol financed emissions guidance. We worked with a whole broad range of financial institutions, including many large banks in the US, to develop some initial methods and approaches for quantifying financed emissions in a more sort of detailed and clear way. And to make a long story short, the US banks got very nervous and were concerned that this was going to become a source of regulation that they didn't have sufficient control over in terms of this idea of total portfolio financed emissions. And so there was sort of a volte-face, and there was a lack of consensus, to say the least, around these methods. And so we did publish those papers, but it was not a new standard. It was not sort of the overarching metric for financial institution climate alignment. And so one of the ways that we learn from that in SBTI is to say, okay, right now, total portfolio financed emissions are not going to be the metric that we use for guiding target setting for financial institutions. What we're going to do is step back. First, we had to raise funding. So it took a few years. We held these financial institutions in abeyance. Finally, actually, a bank in the US, BNY Mellon in New York, stepped up and funded the work in 2018. And so we did a 2-year project to come up with metrics and methods for financial institutions to set targets. What we ended up doing is doing a bottom-up asset class-based approach to say, okay, for example, for electricity generation project finance, the most robust method for setting targets, the best metric, is physical intensity in terms of grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, because we have very well-established pathways that correspond with different climate stabilization scenarios there. Likewise, for buildings, grams CO2 equivalent per square meter of built space, we know what it has to be. With commercial real estate or residential mortgages, there can be linkages. For other asset classes, it's less clear. And so we did this bottom-up asset class-based approach. We launched that in 2020, and that's the framework that I'll describe. And you can see in the past 3 years, we've launched a number of other products to the topic that the framing that Sarah was using to introduce this in terms of risk versus alignment. TCFD is sort of the main risk quantification method that the private sector uses, and we did release a report several months ago linking TCFD reporting with this SBTI. And, a lot of people think of TCFD, sorry, that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, for those of you who don't know the acronym. That's sort of SBTI 101 for a lot of people, and that you're starting to quantify these things, but it's really the impact of the financial institutions on climate that SBTI is focused on, obviously. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward, but I'm happy to circle back. So that framework that we launched in 2020 included these 4 components. So the first was a set of 3 different target setting methods for financial institutions. Again, this sort of bottom-up asset class-based approach. The second was a set of specific criteria for financial institutions to meet to have their science-based target be approved by SBTI. Now we've got 63 financial institutions that have done that. The third was a new open source Python tool. So at the time, back in 2018, 2019, some of you may recall that it was popular to sort of talk about the climate alignment of different financial portfolios. So for example, Mark Carney, when he was at the Bank of England, was talking about the Bank of England's portfolio being more than 3-degree aligned. And his counterpart in Japan was saying the same thing. And so this is a very succinct way of talking about climate alignment, but no one exactly knew how they came up with these numbers and what it actually meant. And so SBTI published a new open source tool so that anyone can calculate the climate alignment. It's basically a regression analysis looking at different scenarios published by IPCC. And then finally, the fourth component here is a 180-page guidance document, which includes 8 case studies and sort of a how-to for financial institutions to figure out how to set a science-based target and what the process actually means. The three methods that we included are the sector decarbonization approach, which is those physical intensities that I mentioned. The other two are what we call engagement approaches. So our theory of change here with financial institutions is that the best way that they can help to support climate stabilization is by engaging with their clients and investees to get them to set science-based targets. That's sort of our theory number one. The second one, to Christine's, some of her points earlier, is new product design, which is something that's still very nascent, and we're just starting to dabble in that with some stakeholders, but it's really the engagement piece that we're focused on, and those are the other two methods here. So this middle one, SPT portfolio coverage, is very simple. It's just the idea that the financial institution engages with their clients and investees to have them set a science-based target. That's pretty clear. And then the final approach is this recognition that not every company will be able to go through the process of setting a science-based target. It is fairly rigorous and requires some resources. And so the idea is, again, building on that temperature rating tool that I mentioned, that simply having a quantitative emissions reduction target, a mitigation target, is sufficient. And then those get aggregated up to the total portfolio level with this temperature rating approach. And we have different weighting approaches for that aggregation, but that's a big research topic. Just in terms of stepping back here, where is SBTI in this broader system? One way that we think about it is as a cycle of climate ambition for financial institutions. Step one is generally measurement of emissions impacts. And so the greenhouse gas protocol, as I said, is a foundation here for the private sector. And that's what SBTI is built on. Meanwhile, this group of Dutch banks began to elaborate the GHGP several years ago. And now it's a global entity called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And they have pushed the envelope here. I'm happy to circle back if people are interested to understand new developments in emissions accounting for financial institutions. But anyway, step two is disclosure, as was already discussed. TCFD is obviously a mechanism. CDP is sort of the partner here that does disclosure work. The SEC has already been mentioned in the US. In Europe here, we have FRAG and ISSB. And various other new taxonomy-related disclosure regulations. Anyway, the next step after that is target setting. And so GFANZ has been mentioned. GFANZ was launched at the COP in Glasgow a couple of years ago. GFANZ is, the net zero initiatives comprise GFANZ, and this has been mentioned by Sarah. So we have the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which is the most mature among the net zero initiatives, Net Zero Banking Alliance, Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which has been suffering from partisan bullying in the US and has lost half of its membership, but still exists. But it's susceptible due to the state level regulation there in the US. Next step after setting a target is strategy and action. And then, of course, remeasurement. So this is the general sort of framework. And we're very cognizant in SBTI that we only play one very limited role in this broader system of action for financial institutions. Finally, today actually is a big day for SBTI because we just released these three new documents for public consultation. Today is the first day of a 60-day public consultation period where we are actually pivoting apropos of this discussion. We're continuing to do the emission reduction targets that we've been doing for the past 3 years, but there's a big enthusiasm among financial institutions for net zero. And so SBTI has generally not taken the net zero approach because we're not into netting, but that's a very dominant framing right now globally. And so we are introducing a new net zero standard for financial institutions. The question is always, I mean, a lot of private sector entities say, great, finally, I can continue the status quo and I'll just buy offsets. And that's absolutely not how it works. So for folks that are interested, happy to share these materials. But the figure on the right starts to summarize how the thinking is shifting here in terms of alignment and metrics. So, historically, SBTI has been very narrowly focused on emission reduction targets, including in our work with financial institutions. and those engagement targets, which are just emission reduction targets of the counterparties. But now we're thinking more about broader alignment and non-emissions based metrics, because it's obvious that there's a need for example, more capital to flow to climate solutions. The problem here from an emissions accounting perspective is everyone likes to claim they're a climate solution. And there's this idea of avoided emissions that, by buying oat milk, you're not drinking cow's milk. Well, yeah, congratulations, but it's still a lot more emissions intensive than water. So, that's part of the challenge here is the relativity. And we've always gone from a historical baseline. So it's tricky, new territory with this broader portfolio alignment work, but it's something that we're embarking on. And all of the information I've shared is on our website. And with that, I will stop and apologize for time. Thank you.
Thank you. And to you, Neil. And we think you're on mute.
You would think after, years and years of being on Zoom, we would know that one, being on mute. So anyway, so I was I was really pleased to hear what Nate had said. I kind of gives you the ground view. And what the sociologist here has to offer to you is kind of pulling back and trying to understand how all of the things that are going on in this space fit together. And so I want to take up three kind of points, like move away from the bird's eye view and pull out a little bit to about 10,000 feet and say, well, what has happened? What is the kinds of issues that Nate is talking about? What's happened there really? How do we think about that? Who's involved? What are they trying to do? And I want to pick up a second point, which is something like, will any of it make enough of a difference? And I want to kind of put two scenarios out there about how it could and how it couldn't. And I want to just kind of lay some scenarios out there. And then finally, I do kind of want to hit up some conclusions here. And I do want to say some things about that I think what's happening out there is really amazing. I think all kinds of things have come together. And Nate was describing it from the point of view of the SBTI, but it's really incredible that these sets of organizations have come together. But I want to talk about the kind of limits of that. And I think going to the opening comments is where I think we are now. So let me say that I want to talk for a minute about climate disclosure, and so Nate was talking about action, and I thought his cycle is exactly right, and I think you can't underestimate. So I think one of the things when people say, well, we've got to make all these big moves and stuff has to happen. Well, the problem here is that we live in this really complicated world economy that has all of these organizations who are living in worlds where they're engaging in competition to try to produce products with other companies. And so the first steps to kind of get anything going, I think, starts around this recognition that people have to measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and then they also have to disclose them so that people can tell what exactly it is and they aren't doing. And I think this which I think Nate described really well, this idea of having science-based standards. That means things are real, they're replicable, and they're potentially subject to audits. And I think you can't underestimate how important that is, I think, in trying to think about financial disclosure and financial risk and all of those other kinds of things. If people have to reveal these things, use the same standards, and again, being potentially open to audits, I think it's important. So the sociologist in me, I want to put the big sociological point out there right now, and that is that, so one way people in the literature talk about, the academic literature talk about all this, is they talk about these things as being what they call multi-stakeholder governance fields. And what a multi-stakeholder governance field is a bunch of organizations, firms on the one hand, non-profit organizations on the other, and sometimes some governmental organizations that come together to create a space where a conversation starts about some topic. And I think to create that space is really, really, really difficult. And I think one of the things that you have to see has happened in this space is that we've had a kind of social movement. And they didn't describe what they were doing very much as a social movement, but it is a social movement. And the idea that goes up and you're trying to engage all these other actors and bring them on. I think that's really at the core of thinking about where we're going to get some change here, is that it's this social movement, understanding this social movement, that is really at the core of thinking about this. And this social movement has been going on for at least 20 years to get corporations to, publicly held corporations, to measure and do something about the greenhouse gas emissions using the greenhouse gas protocol. The greenhouse gas protocol really starts this because if you don't have a way to measure, then there's nothing to ask people to disclose. And then I think that the building of this disclosure, which has also been going on, and I think the CDP has been central in the building of that disclosure process, means now that hundreds and thousands of corporations worldwide have done that. But I also want to recognize, and I think this is really important for our conversation, and Nate alluded to this, but I want to make it more central, is the role of financial institutions in all of this. And I think right at the core of this whole movement has been financial institutions. They were there at the very beginning. They are part of all of these organizations with all those acronyms. They fund these organizations. They've been interested in this process, and the sense that they are stakeholders in this field. It isn't just organizations like the SBTI and the CDP and CERES and the World Wildlife Fund and WRI that are driving this. They're the social movement organizations that are doing the movement, but the financial institutions are the ones that are there, and they've been there from the very beginning, and they've been the ones who've been interested in this disclosure. And I think if you want to understand what's going on, you've got to see that that financial institutions from around the world have joined this. They've been joining increasingly over time. I think CDP at the beginning had about 20 or 30 financial institutions involved. Now I think they're up to about 500. Similarly, and that works two ways. That those institutions are asking organizations like SBTI and like CDP to go to companies that they own stock in and ask them to reveal their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where the potential pressure comes on companies, is it comes from these financial institutions. And I think that the theory that I think the theory of what they're doing is really being driven by the fact that these non-profit organizations like CERES and CDP and WRI and the SBTI and a few others are organizing this. They're organizing both sides of it. They're organizing the banks and financial institutions. They're also organizing corporations. But without those financial institutions being part of the process, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. And I think that you can't separate those things out. And I think that's really important in our discussions about what's going on and what might happen, is to recognize the building of this really, I would call it impressive, multi-stakeholder governance field that built around climate disclosure. Having said that, and then I want to say something about what's happened. And I think it's easy to say that, well, nothing has really happened. But I think what happened is that because all of this kind of built up, it was the case that in 2015, the Financial Stability Board, one of the regulators in Great Britain, created this task force on climate-related financial disclosures. I think that financial institutions and these other organizations had gotten sufficiently big and sufficiently organized that it made a lot of sense for regulators to say, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to regulate financial disclosures, what's it going to look like? And that report, which was chaired by Michael Bloomberg, who I think knows something about finance, has kind of been the gold standard of what all of these governments have been paying attention to. And I think regulators in the global north have generally been receptive to that report. And a lot of that language, if you go look at the language in those reports and you go back and look at the language of some of these non-governmental organizations, you'll see it's exactly the same words. I think paragraphs were lifted. And so I think governments, the European Union is doing this, the British are doing this, the Japanese, the Australians. What's going on at the SEC? Yeah, I mean, the Americans are going to get the weakest version of it precisely for the reasons that were mentioned right at the beginning, and because there's so much resistance and political resistance to it. But I think this means that not only was this field built, but this field, which is transnational, brought together these regulators who then came up with this plan, and a lot of them have been implementing it. And I just want to recognize that if we're going to talk about financial disclosure and what the financial industry has done and its role in all this, I think you have to see that this did happen. And I want to come back now and say, okay, so what? Now I'm gonna get to my second point. Oh, wait, sorry. So one thing nobody's talked about yet is we just sort of vaguely talked about why people want to do this, why financial institutions want to do this. And I can say, if you go back to the beginning, a lot of them really were trying to do good. And I think a lot of these financial institutions and a lot of the actors that are involved in these things, they have motives which are about money and risk and all this other stuff. But a lot of them try to do good. A lot of them were based in pension funds. You know, finance isn't a unitary entity. Finance has different wings and different parts which have different problems. The insurance company's problems are really different than pension funds. And I think you've got to remember that when you start thinking about how these things operate. They of course are interested in risk assessment. They're also worried about their capital allocation, and they want to worry about their risks over the short, medium, and long term. I think you can't underestimate how much a lot of this stuff is about opportunity as well as risk. I don't think they're just trying to control risk. I think they're making investments and they're looking at things that are going to go downhill in the next 10 years in their long-term portfolios. They're looking at things that are going to go uphill. And I think this is the thing that probably scares people like Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis the most, is that, you know, at the end of the day, these financial investors are going to invest in stuff that they think is going to be profitable in the next 10, 15 years. So I just think we have to understand what their motives are. They're complex, they're multi-layered, but that's why they're in this game. So we'll make a difference. And I think, so let me put out the best case scenario. And I know that Nadav is going to talk about, I think that we talked earlier about, you know, why we're going to get to the worst case scenario, but let me give the best case. So the best case scenario is that financial institutions put pressure on firms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or they'll disinvest in them. That's the best case scenario. Firms on the other side of it will be aware of this. They'll want to do this because they want to please financial institutions, and they'll take actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their corporate strategies. I think that's the second thing that could happen. And finally, the governments could use this as an opportunity to produce more binding goals, the kind of thing that Nate was talking about. And I totally agree with him. That's where the next step of this has got to go for firms on not just, I think, on scope 1 and 2, but also to try to worry about scope 3, which is just, as I think you described it, really hard. I think that's the positive case. That's the positive scenario. I think the worst case scenario is that what disclosures do, even mandatory disclosures, is symbolic, but doesn't commit anybody to do anything. And I think that this problem, I think, is the problem of whatever it is that the SEC and the EU and everybody else does, that this is only a little tiny tool. It doesn't commit anyone to do anything, and except for, even if they have to report and disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, that's it at that point. The second is, I think that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are need to be reduced aren't going to be really big, even if financial investors get in the face of publicly held corporations. And that's not going to be the only way that the climate crisis is going to get resolved. But it is a path. I don't know that I could estimate how much it's going to matter, but it might not matter much. Is, I think, not a position that somebody could take. And finally, I think you're just going to get resistance from people like oil and gas companies, utilities, cement, steel, and companies working in agriculture. The United States is that leading edge of that resistance. And I think that whatever laws get passed or whatever rules get passed, you're going to have resistance from them. And so I think, you know, these are the two possible outcomes of this. And I think that this is kind of where we are now, is once these disclosure and standards are out there, once financial institutions have made commitments to using them and to putting pressure on companies, that's on the one side. On the other side, we have these that nobody actually has to do anything if they don't want to. we're going to have some resistance. And those are the two places we are now. But let me move to some conclusions. And the first thing I do want to reiterate is how dramatic what has happened is. And if you start thinking about the creation of this multi-stakeholder governance field of financial institutions, non-governmental organizations, and a few governmental organizations to create this whole movement around climate disclosure, it didn't have to happen. And there's a pretty easy world to imagine why nobody ever would have done anything like this. And I've been studying it now for about 2 years, and it's I'm still, when I go in front of audiences who don't know anything about this and explain it to them, they just don't, mostly they don't believe it. It's just kind of, it's a little bit surreal what's happened. And I think we should acknowledge that it is something. And it has put political pressure back on governments and regulators. And I do think a lot of financial institutions are taking this all to heart and using this. And so if you watch the media, you see every so often some company got some pressure on them from somebody to do something. And I think that that's really going on. But I do think that this is only one step. And I think that the fact that this is really voluntary, and it's even voluntary, even if when it becomes not, it moves from voluntary to becoming that you have to measure and publish your, you have to do financial disclosures of your greenhouse gas emissions. Even when that happens, companies don't have to do anything. And I feel like we are moving like up this hill. I'm not sure exactly on Nate's graph where we are. He had the turning point, the inflection point. I'm not sure we're at the inflection point yet, but I think the next step has to be to make these things happen. And I think that to set goals for companies once they're disclosing, to put pressure on them to bring regulation in. I think that's happening around in Western Europe and other parts of the world. It's slower here, but even here, there are things that are going on. And so I think that's the next step, or the next stage, the next political battle, is to take these hard-won victories around disclosure and measurement and see what goes on to happen next. Thank you.
Neil, to you, Nadav.
All right. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be able to join you all virtually, and thanks to MDM for hosting it and for making remote speaking available. So I'm going to try to give 3 takeaways on this thing called financial alignment that we're talking about. The first takeaway is that there is this thing called the green finance gap. And it turns out that it is very large and very urgent. Okay, so this is from the World Resources Institute. And what you can see here is that for 2030, there is a target of private finance that would be necessary in order to keep the global economy on a path to Paris alignment, right? So if we want to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius, and that path would require financial flows of about $3 trillion per year. Okay, so this is a flow, this is not a stock. Private financial flows of $3 trillion a year, and that level would have to be maintained until 2050. Okay, so we're talking about a stock of about $60 trillion. Okay, no small chunk of change. And you can compare that to where we are today. Can you all see it? I'm not in the room. You see that little, almost like pathetic orange little thing in the bottom left corner? Yeah, that little squiggle. So today we're at 300, or 2020 we were at 300 billion. So a tenth of the amount. So we have to ramp up. You see this 45-degree dashed blue line between the orange and the blue. We have to ramp up 10 folds within, what do we have now? 6.5 years. 6.5 years left. Okay, so forgive me for being the glass half empty kind of guy, but this is a very, very serious and dire problem. Okay, so we sometimes talk about we often talk about the global emissions gap in metric tons of carbon, right? So the amount of reduction of carbon that is necessary to keep us on track and that deficit, that's the kind of work that the IPCC is doing. This is the financial counterpart of that in dollar space, okay? And it is very large. So as Sarah, Nate, and Neil talked about, the role of the financial sector here goes two ways. One is that it will provide the supply, it would hopefully, right? We would want it to provide the supply of this finance, these $3 trillion annually. But as they have emphasized, it is also driving the demand, because once a financial institution comes under a binding alignment commitment, right? So all these things that Nate talked about, once it comes under the technical protocol, once it's broader, financed emissions have to be measured, it will basically have to apply the pressure on its borrowers, on its portfolio companies, to themselves come under targets because their emissions are folded into the bank's emissions. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about alignment and the role of financial institutions in alignment. So that's takeaway number one. Very urgent, very large financial gap. This is a hard time constraint. If we breach it for 2030, climate tipping points and so forth. Okay, take a breath. Okay, second takeaway. Second takeaway is that financial regulation needs to go through a paradigm shift from a climate risk approach to a climate alignment approach. So let me unpack this, and this is some of the framing that Sarah has done so effectively. When we talk about climate risk, this is the comfort zone of financial regulators, right? Financial regulators, all of us FinReg types, we love risk. Capital requirements, liquidity requirements, do it any time of the day, okay? So in the climate space, this is done by a research consortium called NGFS that was mentioned here, okay? So this is a central bank research consortium, and they have come up with these things, you can see them in the quadrants here, these different climate scenarios, okay? And they go from orderly transition, which you can see bottom left, to hothouse world. So this is a full-blown 3-degree warming scenario, bottom right, okay? And then once we have these scenarios, what do? We're financial regulators. We start stress testing, okay? So it's true that the Fed is not doing it, but the ECB and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan are. And this is celebrated as a huge success. And I actually think that it's driving full speed in the wrong direction, okay? This is a very, very, very different exercise from climate alignment. So climate alignment, the kind of institution that Nate is leading, is a fundamentally different exercise from measuring climate risk. Okay, I have a visual aid here. Risk management does not equal. Yeah. Thank you. Risk management does not equal alignment. So risk management is about protecting the capital of banks. Okay, why do we do that? We do that because we think it protects shareholders, more so because it protects the public safety net that protects banks, because it prevents destabilization of the macroeconomy, right? We have good reasons to do that. And when I'm saying that the current approach is driving full speed in the wrong direction, it's not that risk is unimportant. Risk is important and there is a role for risk. The problem is that we have turned our financial regulatory agenda on climate into a basically 100% risk agenda. And that is very, very, very dangerous. When we talk about alignment, we're not measuring the risk to banks' capital. We're measuring actual metric tons, so actual levels of atmospheric carbon that we're reducing. So in other words, we're not saying, and this is the fundamental, you can see it in the NGFS scenarios, we're not saying, let's imagine that the world heated by 3 degrees. And how can the financial system risk manage that? In brackets, it cannot, okay? We're saying, the second wing that Sarah talked about, we're saying, what can the financial system do in order to reduce carbon emissions such that we would never, ever find ourselves in that hothouse scenario in the first place? Okay, so just to give you a practical flavor of how these things work, let's say that you're a risk manager at a bank and you have a portfolio of commercial real estate. Okay, commercial real estate in California, it's fire prone. And the level of your climate risk in the stress test shoots up. Okay, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to sell the loans and you're going to buy a loan portfolio somewhere else, let's say in Minnesota, that is very climate safe. From a financial regulatory point of view, you had just reduced your climate risk. Okay, so your regulator is happy, not the Fed who's not looking at it, but I'm talking about the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of India. Okay, from a climate alignment point of view, we have done absolutely nothing. Okay, so you owning mortgages in Minnesota rather than in California does not reduce the level of carbon in the atmosphere by a single metric ton. So these things do not translate from one another directly, and we could think of lots of other examples. So again, it's a very, very fundamental thing to understand. NGFS, the scenarios, an enormously complex research project that has been going on for years, very celebrated. That is not a way to do climate alignment, okay? So last thing I'll say about this takeaway, regulation should prevent the disastrous outcome rather than try to assume that it will happen in risk management and risk manage it, okay? If your town had a risk of going on fire, I think it would be much more fruitful to think of how the safety measures that you can have so that it does not go on fire, rather than to just assume it would go on fire and to think how you're going to live in that reality. Climate change is endogenous to the decisions that are made by the financial system. It is not exogenous. It is not something that's just a superimposed scenario. So, with all the sophistication of the NGFS and the astounding number of PhDs, climate modelers, macroeconomic modelers that have gone into it, I think the basic approach is getting some things terribly wrong. Okay, third and last takeaway: voluntary initiatives, SBTI, GFENs cannot deliver without binding financial regulation. I think there's a dangerous romanticization in the industry of the value of industry initiatives and consensus building, et cetera. Not to say that they haven't done amazing things, proofs of concept, socialization of ideas. So I completely agree with Neil about the value of it, but it's a stepping stone to binding regulation. It should not be the end all. Certainly not given, again, 2030 is a hard constraint, because if we don't get to 50% down by 2030, then we're messing with the climate system in ways that are going to be irreversible according to science. Okay, SBTI and GFENs are very, very different animals. Okay, all these acronyms are floating around. So I want to just say a few quick words about each of them. SBTI, the organization that Nate talked about, has, as you have seen, right, an extremely rigorous commitment protocol, which is wonderful, and it's a huge achievement. On the other hand, financial sector adoption has been relatively low, especially in the US. So there is no major bank in the US that has joined SBTI. Okay, so that should be shocking to us from a US perspective. Corporate sector adoption is higher, and that is a good thing. But notice that it's usually denominated in number of companies, their market cap, right? So 5,000 companies, 20% of global market cap. This does not necessarily scale to actual emissions reductions. Okay, so we're talking about a global emissions gap of 25 gigaton of carbon by 2030 that the global economy is currently on. We have no ready way to translate these commitments from SBTI to how much of that gap is going to be closed, and I think that is a real problem. Now, if you're a little bit cynical, just a little bit cynical, and again, I know this is, it could be a little bit reductionist, but the companies that would have an incentive to join a voluntary initiative are the companies that have the lowest emissions and the lowest abatement cost, right? If we're just working from economic priors, okay? So everybody gets the same reputational benefit, but if your emissions were relatively low to begin with, or if they were relatively cheap to abate from the start, then you get a lot of benefits per cost, okay? And I think this is a problem that it's not just SBTI, it's every single voluntary initiative has to deal with this problem. And I would be very careful about celebrating the successes of voluntary initiatives before we see what dent they made in actual carbon scaled to the global emissions gap. That is the relevant denominator. G-Fence is a very, very different animal. So that's the Mark Carney initiative. G-Fence, in sharp contrast from SBTI, has very loose commitments. Okay, so if you look at US banks that are in G-Fence, so everybody is in G-Fence, but, well, everybody used to be in G-Fence. Everybody used to be in G-Fence, and I think part of the reason is that the commitments were loose. They were not SBTI rigorous commitments. And when you look at the actual targets that G-Fence US banks have in place, they're usually very limited. So energy, power, sometimes auto. Okay, not any of the many, many other sectors and the many other areas in which they should be managing their emissions. When G-Fence tries to tighten standards, okay, and this is alluding to what Sarah talked about, that creates a threat of disintegration. So all these banks are saying, well, actually, maybe it's not such a good idea. All these banks and other financial institutions, maybe it's not such a good idea for us to be in G-Fence. And because it's voluntary, you're getting this tug and pull between the stakeholders, if it were, the financial institutions, and the initiative, and that becomes a boundary for ambition for the initiative. So I would be very worried about that. Monitoring challenges. So there is no agreed upon framework for monitoring and reporting under G-Fence. Okay, that is concerning. Just think about how capital requirements, right? A lot of us are financial regulation people. Think about how something like a capital adequacy regime would have worked as a voluntary industry initiative. Okay, everybody decides their risk weights, reports, whatever they want. How do you compare it, et cetera, right? We would think that would be a disaster. Okay, so we do not want to have that approach when we're dealing with climate. So what we need is hard regulatory requirements on alignment. And again, that is fundamentally distinct from the current stress testing disclosure approach, which we're using in our risk managerial part of our brains. Okay, so just to summarize, 3 takeaways. There is a green finance gap. It is very large. It is very urgent. 2030 timestamp. Financial regulation needs a paradigm shift from climate risk to climate alignment. And lastly, voluntary initiatives, important capstone, important proof of concept. They cannot deliver without binding regulation. Okay, thank you, and sorry for the extra time.
Fantastic. That was just an extraordinarily rich discussion. I have pages of notes, but it occurs to me, given the time, we should open it. Yes.
Yeah, I propose that we go for actually we go for an extra 5 minutes, so we have a little more time.
That is amazing. If that can, yes. Okay. Wonderful. Good. Right here.
Hi, I'm Alex Howlett, INET Young Scholars Initiative. My question is about the alignment approach, and specifically it's when is it not appropriate to take an alignment approach? What kinds of entities should maybe be doing more of a risk management approach to climate change? And the reason why I'm asking this is I'm thinking about the financial system, the banking system. You have the regular banks, they all die if the financial system dies, right? But none of them are in a position to do anything about it. Whereas you have a central bank that actually is in a position to have an alignment approach, and that's what we call monetary policy. So I'm thinking, like, what's the analogy for climate change?
Yeah, I'm going to let Nadav take that, but I just in terms of clarification, why do you say that it's that monetary policy is really kind of the ultimate aligner? I'm not sure
It's an alignment approach for financial instability, right? An individual bank can't affect financial conditions, but they live and die by financial conditions. The best they can do is manage their own risk. Whereas the central bank also lives and dies by financial conditions, but they have the power to influence the market. Right, so they can take an alignment approach.
Not sure, actually, not sure, but because, I would, just speaking from the perspective of the Federal Reserve, it would be argued, I think, that the mandate of the Federal Reserve does not include the ability to require a particular alignment, that it would necessitate a particular law change. There would need to be a specific addition to the mandate. Now, you're arguing financial stability. You could, presumably argue that financial stability is a mandate built into the law, into the Federal Reserve Act, and that mandate encompasses a ready obligation to prepare regulations that would be alignment focused. I would find that my sense is that that would be a step way too far for the Fed. My sense, given the way they approach their mandates, which is quite narrowly, that they would say, give me a law. If you want me to do that, give me a law to do it. Pass a law in Congress that would require me to do it. And I would also add that, given the current nature of the Supreme Court weighing in against independent agency action, that the Supreme Court would probably also turn down any kind of alignment regulation that came out of the Fed without a statutory mandate. That's just a reaction, and I could be ultra conservative on that. But what do you think, Nadav?
Yeah, so I'm also trying to understand the question better, right? So alignment means reducing the carbon footprint of an entity in accordance with a scientifically prescribed rate that is necessary to keep on track, in our case, with the Paris climate goal, okay? So what would it mean for let's say for the Federal Reserve or a central bank to assume that entire burden of the economy, right? So we saw the order of magnitude of these amounts. They're macroeconomic on a global scale, like, $60 trillion, that's the size of, $3 trillion per year. That's the size of global defense spending, okay? It's a huge amount. The idea that would be borne on the balance sheet of the central bank, which doesn't have capital and doesn't have really a way to risk manage it, I think it's spreading it on a way too narrow denominator. What you really want to be doing is you want to be spreading it on a denominator with hundreds of trillions of dollars of assets under management on the entire financial system. And we're not talking about individual institutions. We're talking about, or at least I'm talking about, making a binding requirement for individual financial institutions and the sector as a whole to manage their emissions in line with science-based targets. So it's basically making the voluntary approach mandatory. And I think, of course, they can. That would make a huge difference. That would make a huge difference as far as climate outcomes.
Okay. Yeah. This has been good. One reason this conference is taking place is because economists don't know anything about money. And one reason this session is taking place is because they don't know anything about climate either. And that is turning up in the estimates you're all using there. And I applaud the work that Nate and Nadav are both doing on this. But if you look at the NGFS, for example, they're basing themselves on Cahill and Wentz 2020, which estimated that a 3.5 degree increase in temperature Celsius would reduce GDP in 2100 by between 7 and 14% compared to what it would be in the total absence of climate change. That's nonsense. It's categorically absurd. And this is unfortunately what underlies all the work that is being done by regulators. And they're not aware of it because they're economists and they trust other economists. We're lucky to be people who don't trust other economists. We're right, they're wrong. I've been working with a company you may know called Carbon Tracker to expose the financial sector on this front. And that report is hopefully coming out next week. And the target of the report is, of course, financial institutions have fiduciary duties to their clients, which we can prove they're breaching by trusting the economic research. So I would hope to work with you, gentlemen and ladies, on this issue in the coming weeks, because it's the economists we've got to take on, and they're the ones who pulled the wool over our eyes over about money and climate.
Thank you. That could actually be yours, Nate, in terms of being kind of at sort of the understanding really the science-based targets. What do you have to say to this?
Yeah, thank you. I agree that it's a different conversation with economists, and certainly appreciate the work of Carbon Tracker. And from our perspective, this has been an area where we come in with a more emissions-based approach. And the idea is the financial institutions, as well as economists, as you've said, they're thinking in terms of financial return on investment and financial metrics. And so trying to link these two is challenging. And so that's what this is about. And, in our journey here, as I said, we came up with these more tangible asset class based methods for doing that linkage. But one of the reasons SBTI has been popular, frankly, is that we're not very prescriptive. We just say the target commits to reducing emissions this much from a historical baseline. How that's achieved is up to the target setting entity. And the implicit and explicit reason is that the entity will have the best knowledge of what the mitigation technology options are. However, with financial institutions, it's become clear that we need to be more prescriptive when it comes to fossil fuels. And I think this is one of the areas where there is this overlap between risk and alignment, where it's no longer viable for SBTI to just say, yeah, the banks and others, just set an emission reduction target and however you achieve it's fine. No, like now it's clear with the current environment and these resources that we released today, we have to have a specific fossil fuel set of criteria for how the investment and lending and facilitation activities are happening with financial institutions and fossil fuel companies and activities. And so I think that is the interface here. And I think, the idea of sunken stranded assets is one that economists have sort of latched onto a little bit here, but it's still an area that needs a lot of development, and be happy to collaborate with you and others there. Thanks.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, thank you. Nadav, I get that you're playing the role of the skeptic, and I want to get Sarah's opinion on this, but as a skeptic of this sort of consortium of outside government stuff, looking at what happened with Sarah, Saleh, et cetera, is it not naive to think that there's anything that can be done through risk management or regulatory control at all? I mean, is that not the naive, pie in the sky goal at this point? And this is the not just the fastest, but the only way there. And I hate making that argument, but I remember last time we were talking about Andrew Ross Sorkin saying we should use credit cards to ban guns. And I was like, that's crazy. That's like admitting that democracy's failed. And I feel like at this point, it's saying the same thing, but I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, go that way, right? I don't know. I mean, Nadav, do you think there's any way?
It's a totally fair point, but I think that point applies about equally to risk management and alignment, right? So everything that happened in the political process and the critiques, et cetera, I don't think that distinction was being made there. I think that a couple of things, right? So first of all, as academics, there are a lot of academics in the room, a lot of people with policy expertise, et cetera. Where do we put our chips, right? Like, what do we want? If we can't even articulate what we want, of course, we're not going to get it. And the thing that we have been articulating over and over again for the past, let's say, 5 years with respect to the climate agenda is better risk management, better risk management, better risk management. Guess what? We got it. And like Steve said, it's really not working very well. Okay, it's really not making a big dent in climate policy. So I think we need to articulate something different and something more effective. And of course, once we do that, of course, we can strategize. We can strategize on the politics, on the law, et cetera. Last point, and I think this is in line with Steve's point. I don't think you can risk manage 3 Celsius warming. I don't think anybody could risk manage it. And I think if when we read the fine print of these stress tests and the kind of risks that they actually emit, the geopolitical risks, the chronic risks to productivity, et cetera, At the end of the day, they come up with an extremely partial description of what it would mean to live in a 3 Celsius world. And in that sense, I think they're really creating, ironically, I think they're creating a false confidence in the idea that this could be risk managed. It cannot be risk managed. And because it cannot be risk managed, even under a basic systemic risk mandate, financial regulators need to do everything that they can to prevent it, okay? If there's a risk that cannot be managed, it has to be prevented.
Great question, Mirza, of course. And, just to underscore, I think what we've been talking about here and what I've learned certainly is risk management. The moment for risk management is probably gone. It is probably gone given where we are right now in terms of proximity to the tipping point. And we also, I should say that the risk management approach was used because it was considered one that was well within the mandates of the regulators. So it was viewed as something that, of course, they would be taking on, and they didn't. Okay, and the political blowback too is severe in terms of their doing anything. And so the notion now of turning to a different paradigm, I think, is quite appealing. But to think that it can be done without any kind of political blowback would also be, I think, similarly naive. Okay, and Nadav, I think you've underscored the importance too, that it is a stepping stone, that we are going to need collective action, democratic action. It's going to have to take the place in Congress as a statutory mandate if we are in fact going to work towards something that looks like an alignment strategy. And with that, I will close. I will thank our panelists. I will thank the audience. A lot of fun.